Hi everyone, and welcome to From Paranormal to Normal, and Happy New Year to everyone too. I am Kate Thorvaldsen, your host for the evening, and Tom Schaefer is my co-host and producer. And yeah, I remember when I was growing up, history in school. That was actually very boring. And I also remember when I was getting to the high school and we had history there, it was also very boring. And it doesn't need to be, because I think that there are so much interesting stuff, ancient stuff going on out there on our globe that we need to be putting into our history books. And today we are going to meet a special lady that I met a few years ago, Jennifer Stein. She is an artist, entrepreneur, activist, and also a film documentary maker. And she has been traveling to all these ancient places that we also want to go to one day or just talk about. And she was going to Gobleki Tepe, it's a very difficult name, in Turkey in 2012, together with a Boston University professor, Robert, how do you pronounce it?
Schock, Robert Schock.
Yeah, and Linda Moulton Howe and other researchers. And welcome to Jennifer Stein.
Thank you so much, Kate, for having me on your program. It's a real pleasure.
And my pleasure too, that you wanted to join in. So where did you get the interest from to visit all the ancient places, or interest for the ancient history?
Well, I was always very interested in, say, mounds and ancient sites like Stonehenge and things that we read about in England, the well-known ones that we knew about in the 60s. I started reading about them when I was growing up. And I think I just always stayed hooked, especially the ancient mounds throughout the United States that we have. They're mind-blowing because they're perfect circles from the air, like the circle that exists around Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is really still kind of a bit of an enigma. We think we know about when it was built. We still don't really fully know why, but we've come up with ideas that has something to do with timekeeping, maybe zodiacal time or celestial time, not necessarily time like 24 hours in a day or the number of years in in a decade or something like that. It could be a different type of timekeeping system. And when we started to learn about Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, this was really mind-blowing to many archaeologists whom I read and follow, like Robert Schock, because this complex was dated to be built at least 12,000 years ago. And that dating
was a very long time. It's a long, even before the schedule that they have been putting up on us.
That's right. I mean, this is much before what we think of as the time when the pyramids were built, or even, I mean, it predates what we think of as the civilization beginning in the Fertile Crescent. We think that is 7,000 BC at its earliest point. Now here we go back 12,000 BC. And for those, did you put up any pictures of Göbekli Tepe? Did you find some online?
Yeah, we have found some pictures, so we will put them up.
Right. So anyone who's researched this site or read about it knows that this is a Stonehenge-like set of circles of standing stones. There's more than one. There are actually 26 all on this hilltop, and only 6 of them have been uncovered. So another 20 remain buried beneath the ground. And these seem to have been deliberately buried, and they are a set of stones that are like standing stones, much like Stonehenge is. So we refer to it as an assembly of stones. They kind of look like they're beings that have come together in a circle, with bigger, taller ones in the middle and then smaller ones on the outside.
I saw some pictures of them, and I must say they was quite heavy too. There was 3 to 6 meters tall and up to 10 tons. So how do they move them back in those days?
Exactly. Yes, we're talking even 16 to 20 tons. They think some of the largest stones are. Of course, they haven't necessarily picked them up and weighed them, but they're limestone. So limestone can be actually easy to carve, even with things like harder stone or with bone fragments and things like this. But the type of carving that's on these stones is very refined art. There's complex animals shown, like eight-legged scorpions and ants and snakes and vultures and different types of birds of prey, and even things like foxes or what might be a similar animals to a fox, but maybe shorter or smaller. Like I'm trying to think of certain animals like they have in Arizona, kind of like a small little hyena
Hmm.
or something like that. Also, things that maybe might be like a cat, might look like a puma, maybe with shorter legs, but a cat-like face. So
I must tell, when I was looking at the pictures, I saw that there were not just like hieroglyphs in the rocks, but there were also three-dimensional sculptures.
correct, Kate. That's very significant because to create a three-dimensional sculpture on some of these standing pillars or T stones, as we call them, because they're literally like in the shape of a T with a larger top and then a smaller, skinnier body. But to create a relief that hangs on one of these T's, literally all the surrounding stone must be removed in order to create that sculpture. So they
Hmm.
started with a much larger stone and then recessed the stone back by finally carving this shape. There's no sculpture that's hooked on to these T's once they're made. They're
Hmm.
they're literally sculpted away. So obviously an artist or a sculptor would understand better about what we're talking about, but it's no easy feat. And some of
Yeah.
these things are quite significant
Hmm.
sculptures. They're quite beautiful. So it really behooves us, who built these, when were they built, why were they buried, and and just we can't even wrap our brain around those three questions. It
Yeah.
kind of it makes archaeologists and people who study human origin and psychologists and sociologists kind of say, wow, well, what came first? Were these and what were these? Were these temples? So did temple building happen first? Or the desire to build temples like this happened first? And then the problem is, to build something like this, you need an organized group of workers, right? You
Yeah.
may even need enough animals to help you lift and move things. This is they call it a Neolithic site. So it's pre writing, that
Hmm.
means pre-pottery, that means pre-agriculture, pre-organization of people living in organized societies. But in order to build something like this, you would in fact need an organized group of people. So
Yeah.
did the
But
motivation
it doesn't look like that people were living around that area, or did
that
it?
that's also the problem. We haven't found their living quarters. We haven't found their quote unquote pottery shards. And we haven't found, their houses. We have traced our cereal grains, things like wheat, barley, back to this area that the modern day or currently used wheats and grains did come from this original area. So we can trace the genetic origins of that food supply back to this point in time. So we know that possibly the area around Göbekli Tepe, which is southeastern Turkey, and it is actually what most people refer to as the Fertile Crescent. It's the very top edge of the Fertile Crescent. So if people know where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are, and the Mesopotamian society that we think is the beginning of civilization is between those two rivers. So this is the top edge of it, where we believe the mythical place of Eden, the Garden of Eden, or as Zechariah Sitchin wrote about, Eden, we think was in this area.
Hmm.
So it's smack right in the middle of where we think civilization began, but it's a good 5,000 years before we thought organized society existed. And so that throws a big curveball up, and some of the major archaeologists are proposing whole new theories now, which is kind of like take it's like the chicken and the egg story, like which came first, the chicken or
Yeah.
the egg. So which came first? Did societies organize first and then decided to build magnificent structures like this? Or did the desire to build structures like this force society to have sophisticated agriculture, domestication of animals, the making of pottery to store foods and wines and things like this? And because of the need to build a structure, we then organized.
Hmm.
It's very interesting. Göbekli is referred to often, or I should say, Göbekli Tepe is often called the first temple because this is the earliest dating of some structure that appears to be something that was just built maybe for worship, or it could have possibly been built for timekeeping, like we say, because it's similar to Stonehenge in that it's a series of standing circular stones, but it has two central stones in the middle. Different than Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a series of smaller concentric circles, a larger one on the outside and then smaller, larger stones on the inside.
Yeah.
And unlike Stonehenge, Stonehenge also has an earthen mound around it. We don't find earthen mounds around these, but yet they were literally covered with earth and small little stones put into place. So these standing structures, which are many of them are very elaborately carved, they were then buried with hand placed, fist sized, boulders or stones to hold them up in place and then covered with layers of dirt, then more layers of stone, then more layers of dirt. And the famous geologist from Germany who was uncovering this, his name is Klaus Schmidt. He's now deceased, but he was very clear in his descriptions that these sites were deliberately buried. And we don't know.
I must say it's very fascinating on the way that they have been doing it, because they have been doing it in a way not for destroying it, but for keeping it, even if it's hidden.
Yes, and even to the extent where it looks like some of the T's are broken and they were re-uprighted, even put on top of, say, bigger slabs beneath them to get them back to the original height that they were, and in the same place that they originally were, as if their placement had a greater significance than maybe we can understand. So they were replaced, even stuck into the side of these hand-built walls, so that anyone who would uncover them would know they were originally there, but they were broken because of earthquake or destruction. We don't know why, but they were reconfigured and then buried if they had been damaged before they were buried. So obviously, a culture wouldn't put this large T stone up, go to this intricate detail to carve it with figures and things like this on the side of it, and then bury it with a stone wall so that you couldn't even see the figures that were carved on it.
For me, it feels like that they are hiding it, but also in the same way keeping it for the future, and hopefully that other people will find it and rediscover what they were, the science that they had back in the old days.
Yes. Now, what fascinates me, I think I have read and studied the work of Zecharia Sitchin, and I actually knew Zecharia, and he really opened my eyes to ancient Sumer and Sumerian history and cuneiform. And there are very ancient texts in the Sumerian literature that's been, say, well translated, even by the University of Pennsylvania, who's done quite an enormous research in uncovering what those Sumerian texts say. So there's a text referred to as the cattle and grain text. And this goes back 7,000-8,000 years, maybe more. The texts aren't really dated. We can only kind of date when we found them. We can date anything that is of carbon material that breaks down over time. We can process that with the use of carbon-14 to figure out how much those isotopes have decayed. So a lot of these texts, we think they're from 7 or 8,000 BC, but maybe they were before that they were carved, and when they were finally buried because of destruction or something, it was maybe 2 or 3 or 5 or 8,000 years after they were created. We really don't know. But back to the cattle and grain text. It tells a story of two figures. I think their names are Anan and Ashtar, or Nanan and Ashtar. I'll see if I can actually find it in my notes. And these two figures apparently descended from, I just found my notes on it. So these are two figures. I don't have their names here. Must be on the next page over. They descend from an area known as the Dooku. And it's undefined where the Dooku is. Is the Dooku an area above the planet, or is it just high in the mountains? It references an area they descend from, and they bring with them information on how to domesticate animals and how to create special grains and how to bring farming to humanity. So the big question is since we can trace our actual genetic lineage to the cereal grains we eat today back to this area, maybe this area, I mean, those texts and the fact that we can trace our genetic grains back there sort of shows that there is some historical overlap between written documents and known, say, botany on the planet. Do these stones relate to that? Some people think that these two figures who descended from the Dooku, Zechariah used to think these were beings that descended from another planet. So many people have come to the conclusion that Göbekli Tepe is founded or created by intelligent beings from another planet. It's a bit of a jump in my logic to make that step, but what it does make me question is humanity's history on this planet much, much older than we think? And were there different branches of humanity that we've lost touch with, but that are our distant relatives or our cousins? And if these are large stones like this, and they are like stones were, say, at Stonehenge, was that group of beings that were here before larger than us? There seems to be a lot of evidence of that in Egyptian history, also in Vedic and Indian history.
Yeah, about the giants.
There's drawings. There's also history of much more ancient civilizations. If you go back in the Indian and Vedic texts, they talk about organized civilization on this planet that's well over 100,000 years old. And that's fascinating. They also talk about Vinyamas or the Yamas. I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, but those were flying machines that gods flew around in. So there was a very sophisticated and advanced
they
society.
also had found traces after a nuclear war for around 9,000 years ago.
Yes.
So of course, there's been a lot of things going on.
It's likely that it looks like nuclear war, because if it was an impact of a meteor, which can do a similar effect on the surface, you would see the evidence of the crater. But we find evidence.
Here they were talking about the nuclear radiation.
Yes, that's right.
People even today are getting what's the English word for it? When you're getting kids that are not maybe losing a limb or anything like that because of the radiation is still on the ground.
Right. Yes.
So I don't remember the name of that area.
Yeah, well, there's a place in the Sinai where it appears that there was a nuclear blast as well. In fact, Zechariah flew there. He had a helicopter pilot who worked for an oil company who dropped him and a couple of people off to literally take samples of this glass-like structure that was all over the desert there. And the only way to get that is with a similar type of nuclear blast. So there's a belief, and then you can clearly see it from the air, you can see it from space, and it does not look like an impact from a meteor, because the meteor would have had to hit another meteor in midair above the surface to create that kind of melted glass, and that's highly unlikely, and there would still be probably impact debris if something like that happened. So maybe these were covered to protect them from a nuclear blast of some sort. But who knew that was a potential? It's really quite an interesting what's the right word there? It's a enigma. It's an enigma.
Yeah.
It's a big question. And it still has geologists and scientists scratching their heads, trying to really uncover more,
Yeah,
more
I
of the
actually
circles.
understand that, because if you're just looking at the history that we have now, yeah, following the years back, and then I think that, okay, here and here we became farmers, before there we were hunters. Yeah, so everything, all of that is just completely destroyed when we are looking at the Gobleki Tepe.
Yes, yes. It does force us to reconsider the possibility that humanity's history could be much older than we realize. And now that we are at the forefront of planning a manned mission to Mars for, I think it's like 2035 is NASA's goal, that we'll actually have a manned, mission to another planet.
I
Now
guess
that we,
will be bringing the seeds too.
yes, there's
They
there's a
will.
there's a possibility that we are at the point where we might be able to consider that maybe someone came here and helped get our civilization started and has left us to evolve and maybe left certain artifacts behind. Certainly we still have to look at places like the pyramids and scratch our heads because there's still no real known builder for those. I was just at a conference recently and heard an archaeologist speaking about the huge significance, which is so whitewashed and ignored by archaeology around the world, referring to the pyramids, in that whoever built them with such perfection that we can't even, of course, do today, and society has sort of de-evolved. I mean, often when we look at ancient sites, we can figure out maybe how they were built and how society evolved, and they were able to get more sophisticated and more sophisticated in their building.
Hmm.
But when you go to a place like the Giza Plateau, they started at absolute perfection. And, just even understanding the significance of the pyramids, it's taken us a couple hundred years to recognize all the significance that the pyramids have, not only for alignments and size and placement on our planet and proportions and number and scale and vibration and frequency, but the more you dig, the more you find the absolute perfection of how these were put in place and have remained in place in spite of huge geologic changes on the planet that
Yeah.
we know have occurred.
Right now, I can't remember the name. I think that it possibly is in Machu Picchu. There's this wall, this stone wall that it looks like it's glued together. And then,
That's
and then
Sacsayhuama.
yeah,
Yes,
and then you're seeing newer and newer constructions. And the newest one is the most terrible one. It's just
yes,
like, what? Can't you do anything better than that? It's just
yes.
terrible. That one will fall down with the first earthquake. Just look hard on it, and it will fall over. But the first one is like steady, it's like
Perfect.
mountain.
Perfect. That's right. Peru, I highly encourage any of your listeners, if they are lucky enough to be able to take a trip to Peru, it's not that expensive. In terms of American dollars, three solei to $1 is the exchange rate, or has been for quite a while. So you can spend a good 2 weeks there for what you might spend a couple days at a hotel, like in Miami or Los Angeles or something. It's really quite an amazing place with so many ancient sites all throughout the Urubamba Valley. This is a river valley with high peaks and mountains around it, and it's probably a couple days travel up the Urubamba Valley through many sites like Pisac and Ollantaytambo until you get to Machu Picchu. You're actually descending down into parts of the Amazon. And the town of Cusco, where you would most likely start. And just even in Cusco itself, there are some stunning examples of a society that understood certainly the movements of the sun and the moon, and they built their buildings with the understanding of the solstice and the equinox and north, south, east, west, and perfect structures of buildings. Even in Cusco, there's a very famous thing called Coricancha, which means sort of like the center or the heart of the city. And this old ancient complex is built with literally fist-sized balls under the main foundation of this site, and the stones hook together with one another so that they don't come apart as the site goes up. The larger foundation stones are bigger in depth, width, and height than the ones above it. And there's a perfect like angle that exists in all the buildings. It's absolutely stunning. And when there's an earthquake, these structures roll and move, much like a lot of Japanese buildings now do in Tokyo and Japan, because of the number of earthquakes they've had. They've learned how to build buildings that roll. So the Coricancha, when the Spanish explorers came, when Pizarro came and conquered a great bit of in the 1530s and 40s and 50s, when he overtook Peru, they built a Spanish church right on top of these 4 or 5 structures, which make up the Coricancha, which was the heart of their city. And in an earthquake in 1951, the Spanish church fell down. And at that point, the local Peruvian people who were Quechuan and had their own ancient traditions, they really demanded that the Catholic Church could rebuild part of the church, but they needed to create an open courtyard showing the original Coricancha structures that were there and how the Spanish had taken them over. So they did. They decided to do that. They kind of rebuilt the church in the style where it had been. So you enter what looks like a Spanish church, and then you get into a courtyard in the back, and you can see these original structures, and it's absolutely stunning. What we've lost is the gold and silver plated rooms, where there used to be apparently gold and silver literally plated to the wall. Of course, the Spaniards took that and melted it all down. There were large sundial discs similar to what we can find in Mexico with the sundials. They had very similar ones, and those unfortunately are all gone. We don't have them anymore. The Spanish were quite prolific in taking most of the wealth that they could find out of Bolivia and Peru and even in Ecuador. It's really quite a shame.
Yeah, it is. Because there's so much culture that they melted down. So we have no clue what's...
And the overlap, to me, going and studying their artifacts and like going to the Gold Museum in Lima and looking at these artifacts, they look Egyptian to me. There's a lot of overlap between Egyptian knowledge and what you find in Peru. I have been photographing some of the sites. In fact, one in Ollantaytambo, something you see again and again is double underground aqueducts that are about 6 feet apart from each other, and they're about yay big. They're often like waterfalls that come out and spill out into little things that look like solid stone carved bathtubs, for lack of a better word. They fill up with about this much water, and in the corner they have a little hole, and the water kind of falls down through them and then drops out and goes somewhere else underground. Whoever built these and for whatever reason they built them is still a mystery. But I remember in 2004 when I was there, finding 2 perfect little underground aqueducts that dropped water out onto 2 perfectly shaped, about, I would say, maybe 6 inches by 6 inch pyramids, which were carved as a relief carving, just like in Göbekli Tepe. It was a solid stone and everything was removed except these and a hole in the corner. So it was this large foundation stone, like a bathtub, with these 2 pyramids in it, and the water came out and dropped right on top of these 2 pyramids. So like, it's almost like they were energizing the water, or they understood vibration and water's connection. And I went,
did you take a picture of this?
Pardon?
Did you take some picture of that?
Oh, yes. I have a bunch of pictures of it. Now, when I went back in 2012, those pyramids were gone. Someone had dug up that base. They chopped it all apart in little pieces, and it was now a gravel base. The water still drained out of this like bathtub area to a lower area, but the significance of this pyramid, and I think it was solid granite because these things had not eroded at all. And how long had the water been pouring off on them? Several thousand years. We really don't know. We don't know a lot about the South American structures, but it's again evidence that there was sophistication in stonework, and you can find similar stonework that was seen in Peru. I saw it in Easter Island. In under the Moai statues, there were things called ahus, which are these platforms that the Moai would stand on, and those platform walls were built just like the walls in Peru. And I've seen
There's
other
a lot
people.
of similarities with the building structures.
Yes.
In I think there was in Herzegovina.
Yes.
There's a
Yes.
pyramid that is
Yes.
not built out yet, but there and of course, Egypt, the Incas, and several other places. They're very much the same structure.
Yes.
But I think there was one pyramid. I think there was in Peru that have, when they have been built, the same kind of structure of the stones, that they have the high one and they had a little one on the top. I think that I've seen something like that in the bottom of one of the pyramids in Peru.
There have been. Yes, there actually have been pyramids. Most of them are built with, the ones I know about have been built literally with bricks, with like mud bricks, and they're now uncovering them up and down the coast. Some are even in downtown Lima. Most of them are severely decayed, but they're similar to like the bricks that that were found in Iran and Iraq and some of their ziggurat structures. They built with clay bricks as well.
I was more thinking about like the one in Gobleki Tepe, the high ones, that there was something like that in the bottom, in the front of the pyramid in Peru. I have seen something like that. There was a big stone standing up like this.
Right.
Well, something on the top of it.
Certainly in Tiahuanaco, there's some really interesting things that make you scratch your head, and that's just over the border from the what is now the eastern edge of Peru. It's in Bolivia. But yes, I mean, I didn't know this, but I had the pleasure of traveling with Brian Forrester, and he's a fascinating fellow. He has many different videos up online that a lot of your listeners could go and look for. And what I like about Brian is he uses a drone that he puts into the air with a camera, and he films around a site and describes to you what you're seeing afterwards. Once he posts it on his computer, then he puts in a nice narration to it. So the site of Tiahuanaco in Bolivia used to be a set of standing stones, which was quite large, but there were not walls between these stones. And the stones resemble standing stones like the ones you find at Stonehenge or like the ones we find at Göbekli Tepe, but they were not, there was not like flat walls between them that there are now. And those were installed in the 1850s by the Peruvian government that wanted to create not the Peruvian government, the Bolivian government that wanted to create a tourist site. So much of what we see in places like Tiahuanaco now, we don't really know how much is the way it was originally. You have to go back and dig into archives and find literally drawings, because in the 1850s, we did not have cameras. So you have to rely on the work of artists who drew things. And sometimes they didn't necessarily draw them exactly the way they were being seen. They drew them to look prettier than they were, or they drew them to look maybe sometimes more perfect or more magnificent than they were. They drew people smaller and they drew stones bigger to attract people to want to go to these places, because these then plates or etchings showed up in books and things like this. You see this even a lot with Egypt. The early books in the 40s and 50s in France.
I guess that people haven't changed, because
Right.
in those days they were drawing them differently, or more bigger, as you said, or more beautiful.
Yes.
Today we are using the camera and the filters.
Yes.
So people are still doing it.
Yes. Yes.
I think the sites must be is more outstanding than they don't need to be put filter on or been made differently.
Right. Now, I wonder, I've never been to Norway, but I have Norwegian roots. My maiden name is Wing, Winge. So I'm Vinga originally, and I have family that came from Norway, from the Oslo in Norway. And I'm very curious if there are ancient sites in Norway. I know you're interviewing me, but I'm very curious if there are.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of ancient places in Norway too. And actually, last summer I had a friend from England coming over, Robert Hulse, and we were visiting a wooden church in just 35 minutes from here. It's from I think it was 1100. Yeah, from the year 1100 after Christ.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of history in that. And it's strange that this wooden thing actually still stands.
Right, right. Well, we know that you're part of the hemisphere, just like lots of North America was under ice when you go back, to these earlier dates that we're talking about, BC and before. That's what I love about Robert Schoch and his writing. And I would encourage any of your listeners to look up his work. His last name is Schoch, but it's pronounced shock, just like getting an electrical shock. And he's written a number of books, and he really goes back into the geologic history of Earth as well that we know of, and we can. He relies on a lot of science. So when you're reading Schoch's work, he tries to put human history in perspective with geologic history and ice cores and what we know about the history of the sun. So he's an interdisciplinary scientist in that he pays attention to what's coming out of some of the newer fields opening up, like the electric universe theory people. He's been to a number of their conferences, and also the study of precession. He attends and speaks at conferences on ancient culture and precession, like CPEC, which is a great conference I recommend people to consider to go to, because this is really the forefront of learning when we start to overlap our interdisciplinary understandings of, electricity, of weather patterns, of geology, of known history, carbon dating, because without solid facts, which a lot of, unfortunately, the UFO community often has to stand on. I mean, there are some scientific platforms we can draw upon, but the more we can draw upon them, the more we can really build evidence for keys to our understanding of our own human history. And we can build reliable sources that begin to open people's minds up. And I'm of the belief that the more we do that, the more we cross boundaries that we have artificially created through maybe religious perceptions or beliefs that can sometimes build barriers that aren't necessarily need to be there. And if we all discover a much more ancient human history, this may help break down some of those religious or psychological, emotional barriers that we keep that keep us isolated and keep us at war.
Yeah, for me, I've always been thinking that we need to go back, really, really go back to the ancient times to try to understand more. And the more we understand, the more we will understand ourselves and our future.
Yes,
the way we are heading.
Yes, I recently had a wonderful researcher and author come to Philadelphia to speak. His name is Laird Scranton, and he came and spoke on the research he's done in an area in northern Scotland called Skara Brae, which is one of the northernmost areas of that island, or not island, the continent there. And he discovered lots of overlap culturally and language and looking at, say, their iconology that overlaps potentially with Egypt. That it could have been the early mariners from Egypt could have actually landed there and set up an outpost there. And he even found similar pyramids that he feels are a combination of natural stone removal for natural mountains, that maybe they put a capstone on and cornerstones and shaped the mountain in ways to create pyramidal energy there, much like you have in Yugoslavia.
Hmm.
Robert Schoch thinks that the natural pyramid that exists in Yugoslavia is nothing more than just natural stone, and that it's a false premise to think that it's like a pyramid. But honestly, I don't know enough to be able to make that sort of assessment or judgment. But finding something similar in Skara Brae in northern Scotland it's in the Orkney Islands. It's really fascinating to me.
Hmm.
It makes me think, okay, maybe there was ancient culture doing things like this. And then, of course, the bottoms of the oceans and what we're finding on the shorelines, like outside of Japan and in the Philippines, and in parts of Malaysia. Amazing structures there that are just under the water and slightly in the water.
Yeah, I have seen some of them, and they are amazing, and they are huge.
Yes, yes, yes. It really is just so intriguing to me. It makes me want to live another 100 years to continue to research more and more.
When you were mentioning the Sumerians, did they say anything more about the Gobleki Tepe, or was it just the grain?
No, there was just this cattle and grain text in the Sumerian text that talked about these two beings, Anan and Nashtar, that descended from the Dooku to bring to humanity farming and the cultivation of grain and the domestication of animals, to literally create societies. And in that text, there is the assumption that they're bringing with them a code of laws or a code of ethics. So there was no specific mention of Göbekli Tepe itself, but then Göbekli Tepe is a name we have put on the site in modern times. It may have had its own site name much earlier that we have lost touch with. Now, what's interesting is some people think these stones in Göbekli Tepe or the central T stones are anthropomorphic, meaning that they look like they're representing maybe some sort of stylized human being of some sort, an extra tall being, because there are long, skinny arms that come down the side of these skinny columns. And they seem to have fingers that wrap around the front with these thumbs that pop up. And you see this in some other cultures, like Easter Island.
Like skinny lookalikes from the Easter Island.
Yes, they sort of look like that, but also you can look at, say, Buddha sculptures throughout, Thailand and Cambodia and Laos and even throughout India. You have these Buddha sculptures with these hands that wrap around their belly with fingers that pop up. So are these referencing spiritual beings or spiritual masters of some sort? There was another structure that was found in an area called Neveli Kuri. Now, this area was about 20 miles from where Göbekli Tepe is found, and it was discovered in the 60s. And it was an area that was going to be covered over by the building of a dam, so it would be flooded. So, in order to quickly grab some of the artifacts from some of these areas, there was major universities that descended on this area and confiscated artifacts and took pictures and did drawings. But in there, we found temples that were square temples, not round ones, but square type structures that had standing stones in them with similar arms and fingers that came around the front. Many of these were partially destroyed with earthquake. It doesn't look like they were rebuilt, but they were abandoned, and they were dated to be around 6 to 7 BC, 6 to 7,000 years BC. So there is a thought that there was this tradition of uprighting standing stones, and maybe they were to be representing gods of some sort. Um, some people also think that the standing stones, and this is one of Robert Schoch's ideas, that the central T stones in the center of these circles might have been literally, if you stood between them and looked at the night sky to what appears on the horizon on the night sky, say on the solstice or the equinox, you would see a constellation that rises. And the constellations that seem to appear are Taurus, Pleiades, and Orion. So what Robert also noticed is that the central T stones seem to be slightly switching by a number of degrees, and those degrees correlate with their dating. So some of the circles that have been uncovered, remember, we've only done 6 out of 20 that remain buried under the ground. So these standing stones, as they slightly shift, Robert Schoch correlated by using certain applications and programs understanding the night sky in different millennia. He recognized that the oldest ones that were dated back 12,000 BC, as the dating moved earlier, and the dating did change, some of the other circles go upwards as being covered over around 8,000 BC. So either it took them that long to cover them, or they built them and then covered them and realigned the central stones because they no longer had the alignment they needed to a specific constellation. So maybe these were gods of some sort, or representing celestial beings, or maybe they represented planets or constellations as spiritual beings pointing to celestial alignments. This is a big question, and it's not really answered. On some of the stones, the oldest stones that go back 12,000 BC, at the nape of the neck, there seems to be what looks like a half moon carved. Now we don't know whether that's like a half moon, or whether it's the rack of a bull, say the horns of a bull, and it's referring to Taurus, or if it's something else, if it's referring to just like literally a period of time, like a constellation of Taurus. Many people think that we are in different zodiacal times. So maybe there's a reference there to the zodiacal time of the bull, and then we've moved out of Taurus into Aries, and from Aries to Pisces. So maybe that's what they were referring to. But there's all these interesting questions.
I think there's lots of more questions than there are answered. So,
Yes.
So do you have some final things you want to like to say about this topic?
Well, I've really enjoyed continuing to learn about this. I first, of course, learned about it by hearing Robert Schoch speak about it, and Linda Howe, and it was a real pleasure to go there with them both and with a number of other researchers. And I hope I'm lucky enough to go back. We need to hope that these sites don't get destroyed, as so many sites have done by the influence of Taliban, who like to destroy ancient history and make their own needs maybe more prevalent. So we need to be cautious and protective of those things. And I hope I have the pleasure to visit some more fascinating sites. And I hope I live long enough to overlap and see these things. But it's maybe I'll even get to do some more film work about some ancient sites. That would be really great, because film is also a passion of mine.
Maybe I'll join you next time.
We have a question from the chat room. Real quick,
okay. Someone
asked if there's still digging going on at Gobleki Tepe.
Yes, there is. A new archaeologist has taken over, because Klaus Schmidt passed away from a heart attack in July of 2014, I believe. So some new archaeologists are there. I want to say University of Chicago and maybe University of Istanbul, but I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to go back and read my updated notes on what's going on. But yes, there is still continuing research happening. there. And but they're still focusing on the first 5 circles. They haven't gotten to some of the rest of the mountain yet.
How did they discover that they are much bigger? Did they use laser?
No, well, yes, they did underground sound penetration, which reacts differently to stone under the ground, and that's how they discovered them. And originally, the guy who kept running into them, he bought the property to be. He wanted to create a winery there, and he is growing grapes on the hill. So when you see aerial pictures, you can see his grapes, and his grapevines are over some of these other sites. So he'll have to either have the site bought out from under him, or he'll have to somehow benefit in some way if he stops growing grapes there. It's very perfect soil for grape growing, but he kept running into these things. And in fact, the University of Chicago was there in the 60s, and they thought it was just some kind of, medieval grave site. They didn't realize how large the stones were, but he kept chipping away at some of these stones for his grapes. And then finally he realized that they were much, much deeper and much, much bigger, and he couldn't chip away at these things and remove them. And he started seeing sculpture on the side of them, and that's when he called in authorities. And that was around 1992, 93, and well by 94, Klaus Schmidt was there, and it started to be a major excavation site.
Well, he has a very old ancient history in his backyard, so to speak.
Yes, he does. Yes,
or in his winery.
Yes, he does. And he loves the film crews and things that come by. This guy speaks no English, of course. I think he only speaks his native tongue there, Turkish, I guess. And he walks around with these big picture books, which he shows everybody. This was National Geographic, and this was Chinese television, and this was Russian TV, and it's him with all these people who have come there.
Yeah. Okay, it was very, very nice to have you here, and hopefully we will meet again, maybe on another subject one day.
Yes, I'd love to come back, do an interview on the Travis film with you. Of course, some of your viewers may know I'm a filmmaker, and I like to do research and do films. So Travis has continued to do really well, and it's now coming out on Amazon, launching on Amazon. And we continue to screen the film and at different conferences and speak on the topic. I think it's done well to help expose people to Travis Walton's story.
Yeah, and I will actually have Steve Pierce coming on next week.
That's great. Well, please send him my best.
He was one of the passengers in the car in the Travis incident.
Yes.
So
yes, he was.
Yeah.
Yes, he was.
So
Please
I'm looking forward to that.
Great. Happy New Year. So good to see you, Kit. And next time I'll do makeup before we go online. I thought this was only audio. So
okay.
I'll be more glamorous.
Yeah. Okay. And for the last few minutes, I will remind all the viewers to take a look on my GoFundMe project that I'm helping out 85 Tibetan kids in Dharamsala in northern India, where Dalai Lama lives. There are 4 children homes there that need to be fixed up and changed some of the roofs because of the water is leaking in. They are living under terrible conditions. I was there back in 2006, and even then it was very, very bad. And I can't imagine how bad it is today. So people out there, if you are listening to this and are feeling that you want to help out someone in need, then go into the GoFundMe project From Paranormal to Normal homepage, and you can see more of the information there. So feel free to share it too. So, okay. Then I will say goodbye from us, and hopefully we will see you again next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Are we off the air?